Swinburne University of Technology.
Today I'm talking about the PhD in psychology with Professor Greg Murray, who's an internationally renowned scholar in this area, in the area of many psychosocial studies, into the bipolar, into training and accreditation of clinical psychologists. He is himself an experienced clinical psychologist and a very experienced supervisor of PhDs. So I guess I'll open up with just a broad opening question, Greg. I guess for a long time, psychology PhDs have sat within a science model.
It's actually a very complicated question you've asked there.
Oh, good.
Psychology considers itself a science.
Yes.
And we often have what people would call scientific methods, but so statistical analyses, for example, are very prominent in psychology PhDs. But more and more over the last decade, I think there's much greater acceptance that psychology actually crosses over into the arts, which of course it always has. And so we are using a broader range of methods in our psychology PhD. So not uncommonly, a psychology PhD will be a mixed methods PhD with qualitative and quantitative components. So yeah, I think actually one of the defining features of a psychology PhD is we have to address methodological questions. It's not a given what methods we would use.
Well, that is really very interesting. So what sort of advice would you give your PhD candidates as they begin about establishing a research question or not?
Yep. So I have to take a step back. So how do PhD students come to me?
Yes.
So in psychology, a bit different to some other disciplines in the university, we have no shortage of PhD students, because if you do a psychology PhD, you will often be packaging it with the professional training in psychology. So at this particular university, we have what's called the combined Master's PhD, which is the full PhD training plus the full training to become a clinical psychologist, the master's bit of it, packaged together. So we have lots of people wanting to come and do PhDs with us, or doctorates, which is the same idea, but slightly shorter research component. So students normally seek me out, and they'll seek me out based on my areas of expertise. So and I'm a firm believer that students benefit most if they come and work in an area in which I have expertise. I know some other supervisors, I think there's a continuum, isn't there, between supervisors who say, I know this, come and do this, versus people who say, well, you're interested in this, let's do that. I'm pretty much up at that right-hand end. I'm very conscious that there's only a small number of things that I know anything about, and I'd be very anxious to take on a PhD project that was outside my area of expertise. So students normally come to me saying, Greg, I'm interested in the sorts of questions you're interested in.
Right.
And then we'll often have a discussion about where am I up to with my research, what existing gaps are there, what questions remain, rather than a student sitting in a chair and saying, Greg, I want to do a PhD, help me work out what it's going to be about. It's already much more focused by the time people get to me.
And you've already introduced me to my next question, which is about a gap in the literature or a gap in the research. A PhD really would bring focus on that gap in a way, would it not?
Absolutely. So that's a standard way of thinking about what the contribution has to be for a PhD. So the contribution has to be, I mean, the gap is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because we're discovering something new, but it's in the context of what is already known. It can't be entirely new. We wouldn't recognise it as a PhD. So it has to pay respect to the existing literature while being innovative, and the word gap captures that.
And in reading the literature, the refereed journal articles and refereed books, etc., the student will come across their idea, how it sits in relationship to those, and where it isn't fully taken apart, understood, described, utilised through that literature. I guess that's the gap, isn't it?
Exactly right. And so that's why we would typically start the first year of the PhD is really reading.
Yes.
And I think that's where the supervisor's expertise is very important, to make sure that reading is efficient. If I was supervising someone outside my area of expertise, we could easily waste 2 or 3 years on that reading because I wouldn't know what the dead ends are. Yeah, so yeah, the student has to situate themselves within the literature. One of the ways I like to think about the PhD, and I do think it's a very important qualification, for me personally, doing a PhD was a very meaningful activity.
Me too. Yeah.
And so that phrase that people sometimes use, that to complete a PhD means you enter the community of scholars in that discipline. I treat that very seriously because I think sometimes, and probably this applied to me as I started my PhD, there was a bit of arrogance about me, a bit of hubris that I knew things that no one else knew. And I think one of the very important, the quicker you discover that none of your ideas are actually only yours, other people have thought them, the better. And so that focused year of really developing a respect for what's gone before, I think is critical. And then within that you can have your self-expression, but it's really within a community of millions of hours, years of work that have, smart, committed people have brought to this same area. You're not going to have a radical revisioning of this. If you're lucky, you'll make a significant small contribution.
That's right, that's right. And you're entering into discussion with them. That's what the academic debate is. You don't just say, he says this and she says that, and here's a quote from that. You're actually saying, and in my work, this is important because, and I have utilised this because, I guess,
exactly,
aren't you?
and you're joining that dialogue. And I think that's really the psychological development that goes on during a PhD. You are, by the end of those 4 years, you're hopefully at a point where you know your identity in that dialogue.
Yes. And I believe, from my experience, that the candidate-supervisor's relationship as a small community of scholars is enormously important. What do you think about it as the most privileged form of teaching, really?
Oh, yes. I think that's critical. We are, again, using sort of psychological constructs, we're modelling for the student as we sit and talk about their project and demonstrate how we speak about things and hop up on the whiteboard and draw circles that are explaining models and direct people to literature and link people up with our colleagues. And we are modelling what it is like to be in that community of scholars and what's exciting about that and what's challenging about it. So I think that's a critical experience. I'll tell you an interesting thing that's changed in my supervision of students over the last year or two. Now, every time I have a supervision session, the student gets out their iPhone and records it.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Because the devil is in the detail,
That's
as
right.
you would know,
That is
right?
exactly
So the actual words, as I say, just check back on our discussion about that, because I think the way you've just summarised it is not exactly correct.
Yes, yes.
Listen back to exactly what we said.
Well, that's a great use, isn't it, of the iPhone?
So that precision,
iPad,
around ideas is something that I personally think is critical. And the iPad helps us pay a lot of attention to that level of detail rather than, I think I get it. We were talking about this today and I think no, it's actually the nuance of exactly what did we say.
And I
the
think
iPhone's
that
great for that.
precision is a lot in the planning. I like to do a sort of a plan which has got the through line and then the ribs, as it were. Do you think along that line
Absolutely.
For how it looks on the page?
Absolutely. Well, there's two things, right? There's the project and then there's the document we write about the project. And so thinking about the project first, one of my PhD supervisors, I had two, used this wonderful phrase, the integrity of the design.
Right.
So, I'd walk into supervision and say, well, couldn't we do this? And he said, yeah, you could do that, but you'd be compromising the integrity of the design. That is a gestalt story of what your PhD is about. And I think it's a lovely idea to make sure we don't get distracted down side roads. So that's the project itself. Then there's the report on the project, which is the thesis document or the publications that come out of it. And that has its own challenges, doesn't it? As I say to my students, that's like writing a novel. And
it's a big job.
It's a very big job. And
I think planning is the key to success in that, to know how the sections sit, how they relate to one another, how they relate to the through line, and how they relate to the project itself. In my work, this means, and how they relate to the scholarly discussion.
It's incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Yes.
And I actually say to students, I think very few people are suited to it.
That's very interesting.
I think it's a task to which very few people are suited.
But many can. I think I probably became suited to it. I didn't come from a scholarly background in the sense of moving through the honours and masters and so forth. So I came from a writing and teaching background. But one of the things I'd like to move with you is, one of the things I and many other people have commented upon is letting go for submission. Have you got any comments to make about, there's a wonderful article that I advise my students to read called it's a PhD, not the Nobel Prize.
Gee, I think if any of my current students or past students are listening to this, they'd say, Greg, go and read that.
Right.
Yeah, because I am very hesitant about submission.
It's a very crucial moment, isn't it? And I'm interested to hear that you're hesitant.
Very.
I too. I think everyone is. But at some stage, I think, I've certainly found you have to say, it's not going to get any better. What do you think?
Oh, that's tough.
Wrong?
I mean, well, I don't think it's wrong. I think it's a really interesting debate, and I have it with because obviously by the end of 4 years the students are very close to it, so I have it with them, and we've had this discussion. And so, for example, with the students' document, we can be up to the 3rd draft, and I'm giving it back to them. It's still covered in my writing, and some of my students say, Greg, are you setting the bar too high? And I said, well, it's tough.
That's right.
We've only got you and I. We've got no one else who knows this document and who will ever know this document better than you and I do. And I say, well, the only standard I know for your PhD is the standard that I would submit it if it were me now. I don't know another standard. I can't pretend that you're a junior academic and so you're allowed to have lack of clarity at that point, or it's 90% there, or, we got the spirit of it if we didn't get the... I don't know how to...
No, I don't think I'm quite thinking along those lines, as much as thinking... keep it focused. Don't move off onto another line.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
You've got as much... It's not going to get...
we're not going to add.
If you go over there,
no. Sorry. I'm talking about a completely different thing.
And the examiners will tell you if they need something else, and you do exactly what the examiners
absolutely.
do.
Sorry.
That sort of,
sorry.
I agree with what you've said too. I don't diminish that.
Completely. No. So in terms of what the story is, absolutely. And I'm very clear, as you said, we start with the project, and we have an agreement about what the project is, and then the job is to tell that story. We don't go adding to the story. What I've been talking about is the precision of the story.
That's right.
And I work very hard.
And that's kind of the
that
through
has to be
line
as
in a
good
way,
as it possibly can be.
Yeah.
I think that has to be as good. But yes, no, it doesn't have to change the world. So no, we don't go looking for more. And I'm perfectly happy for the examiners to say, I want you to do more of this, though in my experience they never have. But for the magnitude or the breadth, no, that's fine. The student and I have to be clear well before submission what the magnitude and breadth of it are. But the precision of the story, I think, has to be as polished as it can possibly be, and that leads to what is often a frustrating last 6 months for my students.
Indeed. And there's one final thing I'd like to ask you, with kind of 2 sections to it, I suppose. What do you think is the biggest thing you've learned, and what's the biggest thing you tell your PhD candidates?
That I've learnt from being a PhD supervisor?
Yeah.
It has reinforced to me that people who aren't senior experts in a field can have very useful insights. Right, so I'm sitting in a room with someone who's just read the first thing about bipolar disorder, and they say something, and I go,
gee, that's quite interesting. It's a different angle.
So it's very refreshing.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
So it reminds me that there's always new stuff. So that's been fantastic. And I say all sorts of things to my PhD students. I think it's a really as you can tell, it's been a very important thing for me, and I think it's an important thing for my students. So I say all sorts of things. The stuff about managing where you sit relative, so you have to have a certain degree of confidence. That is, I know what I've done it well, and I know where it sits. So it's this balance between arrogance and the student role, where so when people start out, they're sort of looking up at the literature, and they don't imagine that they'll ever be part of that.
And in fact, be one of those
area
people. Will be a top expert in that particular bit.
It's learning that, and so some students I think start underconfident, and we need to say, no, you are actually now.
If you have a bit of hubris.
And if you have a bit of hubris, we might need to pull you down a bit and say,
yeah.
I don't think you've situated yourself properly. I'm not hearing that in the voice of what you've written, and maybe you need to just be reminded that people who've spent 30 years working on this and have supervised 14 PhD students have probably had a bit of a think about this, and you'd better read their article very carefully rather than just think you know what they've said. So that balance of sort of your identity and where you fit from student up to expert, I think that's what the PhD journey is about.
Yes,
and different people are sitting at different points on that, and we might need to nudge them. But it is really about that, because it really matters, and people are spending 4 years of their life doing it, and their families are suffering, their income is suffering. It's a huge investment. So I think discussions about the meaning of it for this person, why are you doing this? Does it really matter? Who do you want to be? What's your voice going to be? And that is, we often have discussions around those process issues alongside the substantive discussions about the PhD project itself, because I think you have to work through that stuff.
Thank you, Greg. I think, look, PhD students in psychology and in other subjects will have derived a great deal from what you've told us today. Thank you very much.
This has been a Swinburne production.